Let's get started. I started a recording for this session for the United Marxist Party's reading. We are continuing our investigations into the formation and structure of some form of proletarian association which can produce a revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. We have gone through in the past the Communist Manifesto in service of this, the 1964, 71, 1864, 71, and 72 provisional rules of the International Working Men's Association for the First International. 1901, Lenin's Where to Begin, which was the effective predecessor to Was to Be Done, which we are skipping for the time being due to length. Last time we read 1902, Lenin's Letter to a Comrade in Our Organizational Tasks, and 1915, skipped down past Luxembourg's The Mass Strike, Lenin on the Resolutions of the Imperialist War. In Letter to a Comrade on Our Organizational Tasks, the analysis went as such. In this text, Lenin talks about the required structure of the party and specifies a break between a central organ and a central committee. He talks about the issues in the movement, such as economism, developing division between the leadership and the workers, and the trend towards democratism, all of which had been rejected completely by the workers unanimously in favor of the Bolsheviks line, that is, the Iskra line, as Lenin said. Lenin calls for a militant, professional, secretive, and decentralized movement to be built around dual-party center organs, a central organ and a central committee. He lays out the duties of each and the various local committees, groups, and circles too. Response to questions and suggestions of organizational format by A. Schneerson, Lenin explains how he envisions the struggle of the revolutionary movement, especially under the intense oppression of the Tsar state. And I want to note that even in currently liberal, quote-unquote, democrat, bourgeois states, when the class struggle develops, this oppression becomes inevitable for all workers. We saw that in full swing in the various revolutionary movements in Western Europe. Fascism is the ultimate result when the bourgeois state is threatened. So just be aware of that. Even if it doesn't seem prudent currently, it will be prudent later. And it's better to have it than not have it. So to summarize, Lenin calls to structure the party center along two leading centers which will be in harmony via continual meetings, but allow secrecy to protect from secret police. One, the central organ, which is responsible in general for ideological leadership, and two, the central committee, which is responsible for general practical leadership. The central organ has the power to consent to the creation of new committees, develops and organizes propaganda and propagandists. They receive constant reports and information from the Central Committee, who it regularly meets to harmonize with, and from all local organizations so they can develop the correct line and disseminate it. Information goes up and down with constant reports through delegate or representative in contact with the central organ. Information goes up and down the party, improving its organization. Central organ and committee learn from the circles that engage in practical work and in turn develop the ideological line, which is then disseminated. This is a party-wide mass line, by the way, before the mass line had been coined. And then centralization is maximized to create a highly developed, homogeneous, minimized, and professional leadership in support of the development of maximally decentralized of the party itself. Through constant information exchange, maximal useful information for correct strategic and tactical decisions is made available. Then for the Central Committee, it has relation with all the committees, is made up of the most developed revolutionary forces, full-time, professional, and fully ideologically trained, which involves active experience with organizing and leading revolutionary action. They must have an immense social acumen and reputation among the workers, and they must know large numbers of the workers personally. It manages all the general affairs of the party, including education, organization, and communication. It must include all the leaders of the working movement and direct all aspects of the local movement, institutions, forces, and means of the party. In general, membership should only be granted those with majority or greater vote of members. It supports the decentralization of local organizations and the diversity of tactics employed, while the center is in turn maximally centralized. It heads local movements, with institutions and branches expanding from it, starting as executive agents who bring in the whole working class based on district groups and factory subcommittees. Enters into all forms of organization, establishes all kinds of circles, with not all being public members of the party. Those that are subordinate to the committee in its structure and take orders from it. It is aware of the makeup of all local groups so it can make determinations about. The center must be able to advise, persuade, argue, and conduct the quote-unquote orchestra of the movement. This involves knowing who, where, and how instruction has been received for each committee, who is acting correctly and where and why, who is not acting correctly and where and why, and who should be transferred and where to. In terms of relation from the local organizations to this central committee and central organ, they should create, support, and consolidate them, maintain constant communication channels to the central committee and central organ. The channels of communication are held in hands of reliable revolutionaries that won't go off on their own, and those are politically safe and that they won't cause a scandal or the like. Committees are created by local organizations with the consent of the CO. These are made up of active and revolutionarily educated members that are enough to cover all the work and be representative. When committees are too large, an executive group is made out of those best able to give practical guidance, with its activities subject to approval by general meeting. All circles are subordinate to a committee, and the best members of circles are placed in specialized roles or on the committee. They engage in conferences in every workplace. They engage in secrecy and compartmentalization, with means being irregular, off the books, in places specially prepared by trustworthy members of the local organization. Not everybody should always go, and they should always invite secret but well-developed revolutionary members that make sure that everyone involved is trustworthy. This is an internal intelligence service, by the way. For the district groups, they must only take action when they are assured of safety, focusing on intermediary work or distribution. They can discuss action, but decisions are to be made by the committee. They have independence only in terms of transmission of information and distribution of materials. The local group's composition is decided by the committee, who appoints committee members to each district group to oversee work. These organizations should be extremely diverse and decentralized, allowing everyone a place in the movement, with leadership arising meritocratically and organically. They should engage in a diversity of tactics, both legal and illegal, including student organizing, transport, printing of propaganda, passport production, creation of secret meeting places, creation of an internal intelligence service which looks out for spies and agent provocateurs, organizing the military, organized supply including for weapons, organizing financially profitable enterprises to fund activities, example, worker cooperatives, and more beside. In times of peace, they distribute propaganda and proclamations of the committee for what actions to take. In times of war, local committees organize demonstrations and similar collective activities. They engage in compartmentalization of information, with the openness or secretiveness of each given organization dependent on the functions of the organization. The function in turn determines the organizational form. People who do not fulfill duties that emerge out of the need for secrecy are guilty of direct breach of party duty. They are maximally decentralized, diverse, and varied, made up of groups from all classes and sections of the proletariat. Decentralization becomes possible through every member, individual, circle, and participant of the party having responsibility to the party. This in turn allows for revolutionary centralization and corrects issues created through that centralization. These decentralized committees must have divisions and specialties, with responsibilities and to special duties according to personal ability, experience of membership. They must be organized, and in that organization, they need to be specialized and businesslike and achieve perfection in a practical sphere. And lastly, the committee sizes should be minimized and organized to maximum efficiency, with members having specific jobs that they must fulfill. For example, creating a small directing center, building a network of executive agents which link the committee to every factory, distribute literature and have details on the process so if they get caught, then somebody else can take their place instantly, and form numerous circles and groups aiming at developing the revolutionary persons. So this is what Lin had in mind for a party. A secretive, centralized and decentralized at the same time organization which is militarily organized and allows for very fast mobilization and movement, and has intense discipline. It's not too concerned about internal rules, but rather about responsibilities and that these responsibilities are carried out. The next piece that we read yesterday was the resolutions on the imperialist war. And from the perspective of the format of the Proletarian Association, what we learned here is that chauvinism has no place on any level within the socialist movement, and that we must immediately remove any national chauvinism or opportunists from the party, from the international, because they will create confusion among the proletariat. Next up today, we will be reading through Lukács's Tactics and Ethics. This was written in 1919. So let's get started. For all parties and classes, the position and significance of tactics in the field of political action differ greatly in accordance with the structure and historico-philosophical role peculiar to those parties and classes. If we define tactics as a means by which politically active groups achieve their declared aims, as a link connecting ultimate objective with reality, fundamental differences arise depending on whether the ultimate objective is categorized as a moment within the given social reality or as one transcends it. The principal difference between the immanent and the transcendent ultimate objective is that the former accepts the existing legal order as a given principle which necessarily and normatively determines the scope of any action, whereas in the case of socio-transcendent objective, that legal order is seen as pure reality, as real power, to be taken into account for, at most, reasons of expediency. He, at most, needs special emphasis. For an objective like that of the French legitimist restoration, namely the acknowledgement, in any sense whatever, of the legal order of the revolution, was already tantamount to a compromise. Even this example, however, shows that the various transcendent objectives, conceived purely in terms of sociology which is totally abstract and devoid of all values, are to be regarded on the same level. For the social order which is defined as the ultimate objective already existed in the past, if it were merely a question of reinstating a previous stage of development, then ignorance of the existing legal order represents only apparent, and not a real, violation of the limits of the given legal orders. One real legal order confronts another real legal order. The continuity of development is not rigidly denied, and the most far-reaching aim amounts merely to canceling an intermediate stage. Every essentially revolutionary objective, on the other hand, denies the moral raison d'etre and the historico-political, philosophical appositeness of both present and past legal orders. How far, if at all, they are to be taken into account is therefore exclusively tactical question. Because, however, tactics free themselves in this way from the normal limits imposed by the legal order, some new practical criterion has to be discovered which will determine the tactical attitude. Since the concept of expediency is ambiguous, a corresponding distinction must be established between an immediate concrete aim and ultimate objective so remote from the ground of reality. For those classes and parties whose ultimate objective has in fact already been achieved, tactics will necessarily be determined by the attainability of the immediate and concrete aims. For them, the goal that divides this immediate and ultimate goal, the conflict arising from this duality, simply do not exist. Tactics here assume the form of legal realpolitik, and it's no mere chance that in these exceptional cases where a conflict of this kind does emerge, as, for instance, in connection with war, these classes and parties practice the shallowest and most catastrophic form of realpolitik. They have no choice, for the existence of their ultimate goal admits no other course of action. So what's he saying here so far? I'm not going to take notes quite yet. What he's saying is that essentially the ruling class has already set the stage, and it's already established its own moral order as a basis for society. Therefore, anything that they do that is in support of their own order is immoral and whatnot. And any amount of wiggling within that is specifically for immediate aims within that moral order, and therefore is a form of realpolitik and is short term. They might sometimes break with it in the interest of expediency, but it's never a fundamental break with the morals of the system. However, revolutionaries which reject the entire moral basis of the current system on the grounds that it's the morality of the ruling class, which is oppressing the lower classes, requires that, in combination with the fact that revolutionaries have some end goal in mind, means that revolutionaries necessarily have a break with current moral order. In addition, essentially, they can't really do an intermediate stage of morality where it's like, okay, the revolutionary movement is developing, then therefore there's a new morality. No. They're modeling their morality off of the end goal that they're going for, and that creates moral chaos in this sense. Okay. Back to the text. This contrast helps greatly to elucidate the tactics of the revolutionary classes and parties. Their tactics are not determined by short-term, immediately attainable advantages. Indeed, they must sometimes reject such advantages as endangering what is truly important, the ultimate objective. But since the ultimate objective has been categorized not as utopia, but as reality which has to be achieved, pausing above and beyond the immediate advantage does not mean abstracting from reality or attempting to impose certain ideals on reality. Rather, it entails the knowledge and transformation into action of these forces already at work within social reality. You see. These forces, that is, which are directed towards the realization and ultimate objective. Without this knowledge, and the tactics of every revolutionary working class or party will vacillate aimlessly between a realpolitik devoid of ideals and an ideology without real content. It was the lack of this knowledge which characterized the revolutionary struggle of the bourgeois class. An ideology of the ultimate goal existed even here, it is true, but could not be organically integrated into the planning of concrete action. Rather, it developed in a largely pragmatic way, in the creation of institutions which quickly became ends in themselves, thereby obscuring the ultimate objective itself and degrading it to the level of pure, already ineffectual ideology. The unique sociological significance of socialism is precisely that it provides a solution to this problem. For if the ultimate objective of socialism is utopian in the sense that transcends the economic, legal, and social limits of contemporary society, it can only be realized through the destruction of that society, It is anything but utopian in the sense that its attainment would entail the absorption of ideas hovering outside or above society. The Marxist theory of class struggle, which in this respect is wholly derived from Hegel's conceptual system, changes the transcendent objective into an immanent one. The class struggle of the proletariat is at once the objective itself and its realization. This process is not a means the significance and value of which can be judged by the standards of a goal which transcends it. It is rather a new elucidation of the utopian society, step by step, leap by leap, corresponding to the logic of history. This implies immersion in contemporary social reality. The means are not alien to the goal, as was the case with the realization of bourgeois ideology. Instead, they bring the goal closer to self-realization. It follows that there will be a conceptually indeterminable transitional stages between the tactical means and the ultimate objective. It is never possible to know in advance which tactical step will succeed in achieving the ultimate objective itself. All right, that's a great paragraph. I'm going to copy this link into ESVC text and ask people to come in and help me break this down. So let's see. And then we're going to take this. And then finally, actually, I'm just going to take this entire bit here. So what's being said here? What's being said is that socialism is different than Socialist Revolution is different than bourgeois revolution. It must inherently be one that is a moral one, in the sense that it maintains its or ethical one, depending on ethics as distinct from morality, right? It must be an ethical one because the maintaining of ideological correctness is what produces socialism, right? So, let's see. Welcome, Anonymous Panda. All right, so Proletarian Revolution. The Proletarian Revolution is aiming at a particular ultimate objective. The particular objective is a clear one with a clear pathway to achieve it with intermediary steps. Because the working class knows the pathway, that means that its ethical considerations should never result in either realpolitik without ideals or ideology without real content. All right. And then, because socialism does not claim to absorb ideas outside or above society, and instead sees communism as emerging from the conditions of capitalism. That means that the objective of communism is an imminent one. The process of achieving communism, therefore, is a class struggle which is both the objective itself and the realization of the ultimate objective. This means that the means of proletarian revolution are one and the same with the goal, as they bring the goal closer to self-realization. Okay. Nice. Back to the text. This brings us to a decisive criterion of socialist tactics, the philosophy of history. The fact that the class struggle is nothing other than a sociological description and elevation of events into laws which are effective in social reality. The meaning of the class struggle of the proletariat, however, goes far beyond this fact. Essentially, of course, the meaning cannot be separated from the fact, but it is directed towards the emergence of a social order which differs from every previous society and that no longer knows either oppressors or oppressed. In order that the epoch of economic dependence, which is an affront to human dignity, should come to an end, the blind power of economic forces must, as Marx says, be broken and replaced by higher power, which corresponds exactly to the dignity of man. Therefore, to weigh up and understand correctly the contemporary economic and social conjuncture, the true relations of power, is never more to meet the prerequisites for correct socialist action, correct tactics. It does not in itself constitute a criterion of correctness. The only valid yardstick is whether the manner of the action is given in a given case serves to realize this goal, which is the essence of the socialist movement. Hence, since this ultimate objective is not served by qualitatively different means, rather, since the means signify in themselves the progress towards the objective, all means by which the historico-philosophical process is raised to consciousness and real level are considered valid, whereas all means which mystify such consciousness, as for example acceptance of the legal order or the continuity of historical development, let alone the momentary material interests of the proletariat, are to be rejected. If there was ever a historical movement to which Realpolitik presents a baneful and ominous threat, it is that of socialism. That is useful. Okay. So what's being said here? For socialism, what is ethical in the process of achieving it, or what is ethical, is whatever brings the class struggle to the fore and makes class conflict clear. Realpolitik, or any form of calls for class truce or the like, are mystifying of this class conflict, and therefore immoral, or therefore unethical. Was there anything else that needs to be said here? Oh, right. It does not count. The only valid yardstick for socialism is whether or not the manner of action helps bring about socialism. This is very much in line with Lenin's own words, though he talked about morality rather than ethics. Okay, back to the text. That means concretely that every gesture of solidarity with the existing order is fraught with such danger. Deriving though they may well do from true inner conviction, our insistent protest that such and such gesture of solidarity indicates only a momentary, immediate community of interests, nothing more than a provisional alliance for the attainment of a concrete goal, nevertheless, do not obviate the danger that the feeling of solidarity will take root in that form of consciousness, which necessarily obscures the world historical consciousness, the waking of humanity to self-consciousness. Remember, during the analysis of the communist mode production, right? That's one of the key concepts behind it, that humanity becomes self-conscious of their position and their activities, and is no longer under the grip of some alien entity, which is capital and class society. Rather, humans and humanity is in very direct control over their conditions of existence. Okay, back to text. The class struggle of the proletariat is not merely a class struggle. If it were, it would indeed be governed simply by realpolitik, but a means whereby humanity liberates itself, a means the true beginning of human history instead of class history. Every compromise made obscures precisely this aspect of the struggle, and is therefore, despite all its possible short-term, extremely problematical advantages, fatal to achievement of this alternate true objective. As long as the present social order persists, the ruling classes remain in such a position to compensate, openly or covertly, for whatever economic or political advantages have been won in this fashion. Such compensatory measures effectively worsen the conditions for the continuation of the struggle, since obviously the compromise will weaken the mood of resistance. Tactical deviations within socialism are therefore of a more fundamental significance, and is the case with other historical movements. The sense of world history determines tactical criteria. It is before history that he who does not deviate for reasons of expediency for the narrow, steep path of correct action, prescribed by a philosophy of history which alone leads to goal, undertakes responsibility for all his deeds. Okay. So let's take this. This is an argument against any form of alliance with the bourgeoisie or recognition of bourgeois relations or anything along those lines. Okay, so true beginning of human history. Every compromise with the bourgeois order, any recognition of bourgeois right or legal structure or moral or ethical considerations. Or I will just specify bourgeois moral because, as you know, bourgeois morality does not have anything to do with proletarian morality. It's the morality of the slave owner. Ethical considerations confuses the proletariat and staves off what is necessary for the true conditions of liberation. Liberation forms what is necessary for liberation determines the tactical methods of the proletariat. Liberation is necessarily moral in these conditions. Therefore, whatever correct tactics there are what is moral or ethical. So consider, for example, a slave. Is murder ethical? Probably not. No. What about slave murdering their master? Maybe not in all situations. Maybe, for example, the slave has successfully escaped. What about if the master is currently in ownership of that slave and killing their master would free them? I would argue that that's necessarily moral. In fact, I think that would be not only, I think that straight out it would be entirely moral on every level. Therefore, the tactics, the actions of the proletariat during the revolution, the only question that needs to be asked is whether or not it's necessary, expedient, and actually achieves liberation. Everything that's set up here, right? It's like, okay, what is it that achieves liberation? Class struggle. Therefore, class struggle is what's ethical. And we have to stick to class struggle. And class struggle itself is the liberation. Anything beyond class struggle, like an individual going off and killing some bourgeois family like that, or killing off a boss during the previous mode of production that had abused or cheated them. That's not part of class struggle. That's immoral. However, if cops are trying to stop the revolutionary movement and you're in the middle of engaging in that, then it is eminently moral in order to stop fascists, right? Okay. Nothing particularly new in this so far, but that's a-okay. All right, back to the text. It seems to follow that from the above that we have also discovered the answer to the ethical problem. That adherence to the correct tactics is in itself ethical. But it's at this point that the dangerous aspects of the Hegelian legacy in Marxism become apparent. Hegel's system is devoid of ethics. In his work, ethics are supplanted by a system of material, spiritual, and social goods, which is social philosophy culminates. Essentially, Marxism has taken over this form of ethics. As we see, for example, in Kautsky's book, Ethics and the Materialist Conception of History. Merely positing other values than the Hegelian ones, and without raising the question as to whether or not the quest for socially correct values, socially correct goals, irrespective of the inner motives of the action, is thereby in itself ethical. although it's clear that the question of ethics can only proceed from these socially correct goals. People who deny the ethical ramifications which arise at this point also deny their ethical possibility, come into conflict with the most primitive universal psychological facts, consciousness, and the sense of responsibility. What all such people are concerned with is not primarily what a person did or wanted, as governed by the norms of social and political action, but whether or not whether what he did or wanted or why he did it or wanted it was objectively correct or false. The question of the whys and wherefores, however, can only arise in individual cases. It has no meaning except in relation to the individual. In sharp contrast to the tactical question of objective correctness, the unambiguous resolution of which is found to be determined is only to be found in the collective action of groups of human beings. Therefore, we may state the question which confronts us in these terms. How do conscience and the sense of responsibility of the individual relate to the problem of tactically correct collective action? All right, so now we're moving from consequential ethics to consequentialism versus, I think it's, yeah. Oh no, it's not that. It's basically whether or not the intentions matter. So do intentions matter? It is there by itself. And then we're going to put that. And then that. And what we're going to say is Marxism is concerned primarily about, or let's say, what the ultimate question is whether or not, or no, let me rephrase that. Correct tactics for liberation struggle is in itself ethical. However, there are other considerations. The question is if intentions matter. This is necessarily individualistic, even if it is socially determined. Therefore, full moral and ethical correctness requires every communist to engage in correct tactical actions, class struggle, and do it with the correct motivations. Okay. Back to the text. It is most important at this juncture to establish a mutual dependence, precisely because the two types of action being related are essentially independent of each other. On the one hand, the question given whether of any given tactical decision is right or wrong is independent of the question whether or not the decision was determined by moral motives on the part of those who act in accordance with it. On the other hand, an action that springs from the purest ethical source can, from a tactical point of view, be completely mistaken. This independence of each other, however, is more apparent than real. For, as we shall later see, once a purely ethically motivated action of the individual brings him into the field of politics, even its objective historico-philosophical correctness or incorrectness can no longer be a matter of ethical indifference. Moreover, by virtue of the historico-philosophical orientation of socialist tactics, a collective action must arise in that one individual will. Once the many individual wills have been aggregated, and the governing historico-philosophical consciousness must express itself in him, particularly since the necessary rejection of the immediate advantage in the interest of the ultimate objective would otherwise be impossible. The problem can now be posed in the following terms. What ethical considerations inspire in the individual the decision that the necessary historico-philosophical consciousness he possesses can be transformed into correct political action, example, component of a collective will, and can also determine the action? So what he's saying is that because these are necessarily independent subjects, right? This question right here must be answered by way of essentially you start on one end and you end at the other. And the way that he does that is by proposing this question. Which is essentially what ethical considerations lead to the development of the correct tactics, which will be necessarily ethical. And that, therefore, is what we can consider to be the true ethical position of any communist, right? Yes, it's the tactics that determine the ethics. And therefore, we need to work back and build an ethical, an ethics based on those tactics. An ethics that will lead to those tactics. We must build an ethical perspective which leads to correct tactics. Okay. To re-emphasize the point, ethics relate to the individual, and the necessary consequence of this relationship is that the individual's conscience, and sense of responsibility are confronted with the postulate that he must act as if on his action or inaction depended the changing of the world's destiny, the approach of which is inevitably helped or hindered by the tactics he is about to adopt. So, for example, the question of global warming. Where were you during COP26? Or is it 27 now? I don't remember. Wherein the oil-bearing states in particular were granted control over it right at the eve of COP28, yeah. Right at the eve of the point where it's essentially there's no chance, right? We're looking at billions dead in the coming decades. Where were we? Were these the tactics that we should have adopted? Was it ethical for us to be sitting at our computers, talking about it, rather than going out and taking action? What kind of action would have been correct? Well, we don't know what kind of action would have been correct because we haven't developed the struggle to the point where action can be done, except technically the correct and ethical action in those sense would be to work to develop, because it's a step-by-step ethics, right? We're all guilty. So yeah. Back to the text. For in the realm of ethics, there's no neutrality and no impartiality. Even he who is unwilling to act must be able to account to his conscience for his inactivity. Yep. Everyone who at the present time opts for communism is therefore obliged to bear the same individual responsibility for each and every human being who dies for him in the struggle, as if he had killed them all. He himself had killed them all. But all those who ally themselves to the other side in the defense of capitalism must bear the same individual responsibility for the destruction entailed in the new imperialist revanchist wars, which are surely imminent, for the future oppression of the nationalities and classes. From the ethical point of view, no one can escape the responsibility with the excuse that he is only an individual on whom the fate of the world does not depend. Not only can this not be known objectively for certain, because it's always possible that will depend precisely on the individual, but this kind of thinking is also made impossible by the very essence of ethics, by conscience and the sense of responsibility. He whose decision does not arise from such considerations, no matter how highly developed a creature he may be, he may otherwise be, exists in ethical terms at a primitive, unconscious, instinctual level. Okay. This is a good paragraph, if a depressing one. Okay, so ethics, therefore, are individual and based on individual conscience, conscience, what the, okay, and sense of responsibility. Therefore, because we do not know the future, we must assume that we may be in a position wherein we have the greatest responsibility in order to act, to act ethically, engage in the correct tactics. Okay, no one can pretend like they do not have ethical responsibility because they are an individual. In this sense. Okay. Back to the text. This purely formal and ethical definition of individual action, however, does not clarify sufficiently the relationship between tactics and ethics. When the individual who makes an ethical decision within himself then follows or rejects a particular tactical course, he moves on to a special level action, that politics and the distinctionness of his action entails. From the standpoint of pure ethics, the consequence that he must know under circumstances, what circumstances and how he acts. The concept of knowledge thereby introduced into the argument requires further clarification. On the one hand, knowledge is by no means to be taken as total understanding of the actual political situation and all its possible consequences, nor, on the other hand, can it be regarded as a result of purely subjective deliberations, where, that is, the individual concerned acts, quote, to the best of his ability and in good faith. If the former were the case, every human action would be impossible from the outset. If the latter, the way would be clear for extreme levity and frivolity, and every moral standard would become illusory. Since so, the individual's seriousness and sense of responsibility constitute a moral standard for every deed, implying that the individual concerned could know the consequence of his deeds. The question arises whether or not, in the light of this knowledge, he could answer for these consequences to his conscience. This objective possibility admittedly varies according to the individual and from case to case, but essentially, both for the individual and from case to case, is always determinable. Even now, for every socialist, the actual historico-philosophical pressure of the social ideal of socialism determines both the content of the objective possibilities for realizing that ideal, and also the very fact that the criterion of possibility should itself be possible. For every socialist, then, morally correct action is related fundamentally to the correct perception of the given historico-philosophical situation, which in turn is only feasible through the efforts of every individual to make the self-consciousness conscious for himself. The first unavoidable prerequisite for this is the formation of class consciousness. In order for correct action to become an authentic, correct regulator, class consciousness must raise itself to the level of the merely given. It must remember its world historical mission and its sense of responsibility. For the class interests, the attainment of which makes up the content of class conscious action, coincides neither with the sum of the personal interests of the individual belonging to the class, nor with the immediate short-term interests of the class as a collective entity. The class interests which will bring socialism about and the class consciousness in which they find expression signify a world historical mission. And hence, too, the objective possibility mentioned above implies a question. Has the historical moment already arrived which leads, or rather leads from the stage of steady approach to that of true realization? Okay. Let's see. We're taking all of this. So he's giving a caveat to the above. We know that we have to recognize that, we have to assume that it might all be on you. You're in a relay race. And, you might be in a situation wherein you're sitting there saying, hey, look at how far ahead we are. Or look at how far behind we are. It's all on you, though. You never know. Even if you're really far behind, the other guys, they might all suddenly trip and hurt themselves. And you have to, finish the race. And you have a shot. Or maybe, if you don't try hard enough, the other guys are actually really insane and manage to catch up. It might all be on you. You never know. You might be the fulcrum by which history moves itself, simply by your placement in it and the conditions of the world. But, obviously, this is to varying degrees true and false. Somebody who comes from an uneducated background, who lacks access to stuff, who doesn't have any basis in any sort of philosophy or historical understanding, is obviously going to find it far more difficult for somebody else in order to become a member of importance. But you do still have people like Fred Hampton, right? Barely educated, poor black background, genius though, active, moral, intelligent. You never know. But you gotta do your best. So, let's take a look at this. Individual responsibility is decided in many ways by the individual himself. However, one can make very clear determinations about it based on their position in society. The higher, the greater the responsibility they can be expected to have, not foisted, just have. Okay. For every socialist, the morally correct action is derived from proper understanding of historico-philosophical situation, which is understood through class consciousness. This is because it tells the socialist their level of individual responsibility in the movement, because it tells them exactly to what degree the movement is developed and what they can do as an individual versus what they can't do. Class consciousness becomes in order for tactics or correct tactics to become the authentic, correct regulator, class consciousness must become fully developed. Okay. You guys get to see how I type, by the way. This is literally how I type. Tons of deleting and then retyping and deleting and retyping. Okay. Back to text. Every individual must, however, be aware that by the very nature of the matter, we can only talk in terms of a possibility. We cannot conceive of a human science which could say for society, with the accuracy and certainty that characterizes the astronomer's prediction of the appearance of a comet. Today, the time has yet come for the realization of the principles of socialism. Likewise, there exists no science which could say today's the time. It's not yet ripe. We must wait. It will come tomorrow or in another 2 years. Science knowledge can indicate only possibilities, and it is only within the realm of the possible that moral, responsible action, truly human action, is itself possible. For the individual who seizes the possibility, however, there is, if he is a socialist, no choice and no hesitation. This is not by any means to suggest that the action which arises in this fashion must necessarily be morally faultless and unexceptional. It is not the task of ethics to invent prescriptions for correct actions, nor to iron out and deny the insuperable, tragic conflicts of human destiny. On the contrary, ethical self-awareness makes it quite clear that there are situations, tragic situations, in which it is impossible to act without burdening oneself with guilt. But at the same time, it teaches us that when even faced with the choice of two ways of incurring guilt, we should still find that there's a standard attached to correct and incorrect action. This standard we call sacrifice. And just as the individual who chooses between two forms of guilt finally makes a correct choice when he sacrifices his inferior self on the altar of the higher idea, so it also takes strength to assess the sacrifice in terms of the collective action. In the latter case, however, the idea represents an imperative of the world historical situation, a historico-philosophical mission. In one of his novels, Ropshin Borsavinskov, footnote, of particular importance to Lukacs were the Memoirs of a Terrorist and What Never Happened, a novel of the Revolution. The latter work treats the unworldliness of the Russian revolutionaries. In a letter to Paul Ernst of May 4th, 1915, Lukacs wrote, quote, "Considering Ropshin's books as documents rather than works of art, I did not at all see them as pathological symptoms, but instead as a new manifestation of the old conflict between a primary ethic, obligation towards institutions, and a secondary ethic, obligation towards the soul. The question of primacy always takes on a peculiar dialectical complexity when the soul is not sufficient unto itself, but is involved in mankind, as in the case of political man of the revolutionary. Here, if the soul is to be saved, the soul must be sacrificed. Starting from a mystical ethic, one is forced to become a brutal realpolitiker, to violate the absolute commandment, thou shalt not kill, which entails no obligation to institutions." Back to text. So in one of his novels, Ropshin, the leader of the terrorist group during the Russian Revolution from 1904 to 1906, put the problem of individual terror in the following terms. Quote, "Murder is not allowed. It is an absolute and unpardonable sin. It may not, but yet it must be committed." Elsewhere in the same book he sees not the justification, that is impossible, but the ultimate moral basis of the terrorist's act as a sacrifice for his brethren, not only of his life, but also of his purity, his morals, his very soul. In other words, only he who acknowledges unflinchingly, without any reservations, that murder is under no circumstances to be sanctioned, can commit the murderous deed that is truly and tragically moral. To express the sense of the most profound human tragedy in the incomparably beautiful words of Hebel Judith, "Even if God had placed sin between me and the deed enjoined upon me, who am I to be able to escape it?" End quote. So yeah, that's a little depressing. He's basically saying, hey, look, sometimes you're put between a rock and a hard place, and no matter what choice you're going to make, the correct one or the incorrect one, you're going to do some immoral shit. And you have no choice about it. And sometimes, well, one doesn't make revolution with white gloves. You're going to be stained red in blood at some point. Okay. Let's take this. Okay. Ethics does not prescribe correct action. That emerges from class struggle. In the course of this struggle, however, we may be confronted with choices that are equally unpalatable. Under those conditions, the correct action will be sacrifice towards the higher ideal, or the higher idea. This higher idea is necessarily in terms of collective action and an imperative and must be imperative in the world historical situation. Okay. And that is Tactics and Ethics by György Lukács. We'll go through this later and do a full textual analysis. But for now, let us move on to the next piece. See you then.